The room did not erupt. It froze. Crystal glasses stood untouched. Linen lay perfectly folded. And yet something irreversible had just happened inside the most controlled space of the palace. No one spoke. Not because they were told not to, but because the rules they lived by had suddenly failed to explain what they had seen. Prince William did not react the way history expected him to. There was no raised voice, no anger, only a stillness so deliberate it commanded more authority than any shout ever could. Across the long dining table, eyes avoided one another. Senior aides felt the shift before they understood it. Guards straightened, not by instruction, but by instinct. Somewhere between protocol and instinct, the balance of power had begun to tilt. This was not a family disagreement. This was not a private misunderstanding. This was a breach, witnessed, undeniable, and deeply inconvenient to ignore. When William finally spoke, his words were calm, precise, and devastating in their restraint. They did not accuse. They did not explain. They simply erased the assumption that silence would continue to protect the crown. Because in that moment, inside a room built for ceremony and control, authority did not ask permission. It asserted itself. And what followed would force the monarchy to confront a truth it had spent years carefully avoiding. The silence arrived before anyone understood why. It settled across the private dining chamber not like calm, but like a held breath, tight, alert, unwilling to release. The kind of silence that follows something instinctively wrong, something that violates rules so deeply ingrained they are rarely spoken aloud. The long table remained untouched, plates still warm, crystal glasses unraised, linen folded with ceremonial precision. Every detail of royal order remained intact, except the atmosphere. Prince William did not move. He stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, posture immaculate, his gaze steady but distant, as though he were measuring something invisible in the air. Around him, senior household members sat frozen, their expressions carefully neutral yet subtly strained. No one dared to speak. No one dared to look directly at anyone else for too long. This room had witnessed decades of controlled conversation, measured disagreements, quiet compromises, tradition enforced through tone rather than command. What it had never witnessed was uncertainty about who held authority. That uncertainty was now unmistakable. A faint sound broke the stillness, a restrained inhale from one of the ladies in waiting, sharp enough to register, quiet enough to be involuntary. It was not meant to be heard, but it was. And once heard, it could not be unrecognized. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not react immediately. He allowed the moment to exist, to confirm itself. Power, he understood, was not exercised through haste. It was exercised through control. The chandeliers overhead cast steady light across the table, reflecting off polished silver and porcelain. Portraits along the walls. Former monarchs, heirs, consorts, looked down with painted composure, their expressions locked in historical calm. They had seen crises before. They had not seen this one. William finally spoke. Everyone except senior security and household leadership, he said evenly, will leave the room. The words were calm, precise, unembellished. No one moved. Royal protocol did not prepare people for orders like this. Not in this space, not in this tone. Commands here were implied, not declared. Authority flowed through precedent, not interruption. William lifted his eyes. I will repeat myself once, he said quietly. The shift was immediate. Chairs slid back in controlled unison. Aides rose first, trained to obey tone as much as language. A private secretary gathered papers that no longer mattered. An equerry hesitated for half a second, just long enough to register the gravity of what was unfolding, before stepping back toward the doors. No one spoke as they exited. No glances were exchanged. The sound of footsteps on marble echoed softly, disciplined, restrained, but heavy with awareness. Each step carried the knowledge that they were leaving behind a moment that would not be undone. The doors closed. The chamber now held only a handful of figures. Prince William, 2 senior guards, the head of household operations, a legal advisor from the private office, and Camilla. She remained seated. Her posture was composed, her expression controlled, but her stillness was no longer neutral. It was deliberate, defiant in its restraint. Her hands rested lightly near the table's edge, finger steady, chin lifted just enough to signal that she did not recognize the authority that had just been exercised. William did not look at her at first. He took a step forward, then another, stopping beside his chair. He placed one hand against his back, not to steady himself, but to anchor the moment. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter than before. "What occurred here," he said, "was witnessed." Camilla's eyes flickered, not to him, but briefly to the guards. Witness meant recorded. Recorded meant remembered. "I think you're mistaken," she replied coolly. "This is being misinterpreted." William turned then. "You will not speak over me," he said. There was no anger in his voice, no volume, only certainty. The guards straightened slightly, instinctively aligning themselves with the authority now clearly asserted. The legal advisor lowered his gaze, already anticipating what would be required next. "This chamber," William continued, "operates under private family protocol. That protocol exists to preserve dignity, not to excuse conduct." Camilla rose from her chair. "You are forgetting yourself," she said sharply. "You are not." "I am exactly where I am required to be," William replied. "And you are not." The words landed with weight. He turned toward the head of household operations. "Effective immediately," William said. "This dinner is concluded. This meeting is terminated. And personal effects belonging to Camilla will be packed tonight." For the first time, the room reacted. The head of household inhaled sharply before responding. "Sir." "Tonight," William repeated, quietly, with full documentation. The legal advisor's pen was already moving. Camilla's composure cracked. Not completely, but enough to reveal disbelief beneath it. "This is outrageous," she said. "You do not have the authority to do this." William met her gaze fully now. "I do," he said, "and I am exercising it." She laughed once, a short, incredulous sound. "You think this will stand?" she asked. "You think you can simply remove me?" "I am not removing you," William said calmly. "I am enforcing boundaries that should never have been crossed." He turned to the guards. "You may proceed." They hesitated, not from disobedience, but from the unprecedented nature of the instruction. One glance passed between them. Then they moved. Camilla stepped back as reality replaced rhetoric. "This will not stay contained," she warned. "You are destabilizing the institution you claim to protect." William did not raise his voice. "Institutions do not collapse from correction," he said. "They collapse from silence." She was escorted from the chamber without ceremony. The doors closed behind her. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer stunned. It was settled. William remained standing, his breathing controlled, measured. The moment demanded stillness, not reaction. Around him, the remnants of order slowly reassembled themselves. "I want a sealed internal record," he said to the legal advisor. "No summaries, no omissions." "Yes, sir." "And a full review," William continued, "of prior incidents. Anything dismissed, anything deferred." The advisor nodded. This was no longer damage control. This was excavation. William moved toward the window, looking out over the palace grounds. The lights outside glowed steadily, the architecture unshaken, the illusion of permanence intact. But inside the walls, something fundamental had shifted. Behind him, staff quietly exited, leaving him alone in the chamber. The camera would not follow them. It would remain with the empty chair at the far end of the table. Perfectly aligned, untouched, suddenly vacant of assumed power. Somewhere deeper within the palace, doors were opening. Orders were being executed. Belongings were being cataloged by glove hands, recorded with procedural neutrality. This was not chaos. This was correction. And as William stood alone beneath the chandeliers, one detail remained unresolved. A glance exchanged earlier, a gesture too practiced to be accidental, a silence that had existed long before tonight. This incident was not isolated. It was the beginning of a reckoning that had waited far too long. The palace did not react the way the outside world would have expected. There were no raised alarms, no hurried meetings announced, no visible disruption to the rhythm of the household. Breakfast was served on time. Corridors were clear with the same measured efficiency. Guards changed shifts as scheduled, their expressions unreadable. From the outside, the crown appeared unchanged. But beneath that surface, something had been set in motion. Quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle, the knight's order had not echoed through loud declarations. It had traveled through glances, sealed folders, and doors that closed more carefully than usual. Within hours, senior aides understood that the structure they relied on for years was being examined, not ceremonially, but mechanically, and that distinction mattered. Royal life was governed not by emotion, but by systems, by layers of protocol designed to absorb shock, redirect tension, and preserve continuity. These systems were not written to protect individuals. They existed to protect the institution from itself. Now, those same systems were being turned inward. In a narrow corridor lined with portraits of former monarchs, William's private secretary walked alone, a leather-bound folder held tightly under one arm. The portraits watched in silence. Faces that had survived wars, abdications, scandals carefully buried beneath time. Each frame represented a reign shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was celebrated. The secretary did not look up. The destination lay beyond a restricted door, marked only by tradition, and a brass handle polished by decades of restrained use. Inside waited records that were never meant to form a narrative, only fragments. Incidents documented just enough to be dismissed. Concerns recorded without conclusion. Inside the room, the air smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. Tall shelves stretched toward the ceiling, stacked with ledgers and sealed envelopes. This was not an archive for history. It was an archive for containment. A senior aide was already there, seated at the long table, glasses resting low on his nose as he reviewed a document he had not expected to see again. "They're opening this," he said quietly, without looking up. The secretary nodded once. By instruction. No further explanation was needed. For generations, royal protocol had functioned on a hierarchy of authority, so precise it rarely required enforcement. Rank was understood. Boundaries were assumed. And when they were crossed, the system responded not with confrontation, but with absorption. An awkward moment would be reframed as misunderstanding. A complaint would be softened into concern. A pattern would be reduced to coincidence. Harmony, after all, was considered a virtue, but harmony had a cost. In another wing of the palace, a senior member of household staff paused outside a private office, hand hovering over the doorframe before knocking. Inside sat a woman who had served the crown longer than most have been alive, her loyalty unquestioned, her discretion legendary. She looked up as the knock came. "You're late," she said mildly. "Yes," he replied. "I was delayed." He did not say why. She studied his face for a moment, then gestured for him to sit. Between them lay a slim folder, unmarked, its edges worn. "They've asked for review," he said finally. Her expression did not change. "Of what nature?" "Past conduct," he answered. "Anything previously assessed and resolved." She leaned back slightly. "Resolved," she repeated. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. In royal terms, resolution rarely meant conclusion. It meant containment. It meant that whatever had occurred had been deemed less dangerous than the consequences of addressing it openly. She opened the folder. Inside were notes, brief, formal, carefully worded. A raised voice here. A dismissed concern there. En aiderait à s'inquiéter. A schedule adjusted without explanation. None of it, on its own, appeared alarming. Together, it formed something else. "This was addressed at the time," she said evenly. "Yes," he replied, "but not examined." She closed the folder. "They are the same thing," she said. "They are not," he answered. Elsewhere, in a sunlit office overlooking the gardens, William stood alone, hands clasped behind his back as he stared through the glass. From this vantage point, the palace grounds appeared immaculate. Hedges trimmed, pathways symmetrical, fountains flowing with controlled elegance. Order was visible here, reassuring. Behind him, his legal advisor waited. "The authority is clear," the advisor said carefully. "As heir, you are entitled to initiate internal review where conduct intersects with institutional risk." William did not turn. "And resistance?" he asked. "There will be concern," the advisor replied. "Not opposition. Not openly." William nodded once. Concern was expected. Concern was manageable. What he was testing now was not legality, but culture. The monarchy had survived centuries not because it was inflexible, but because it adapted quietly. It bent rules without appearing to break them. It absorbed moral tension into tradition until memory dulled its edges. But adaptation required awareness, and awareness required acknowledgement. The dinner incident had forced that acknowledgement into the open, not because of what had occurred, but because it had been witnessed by too many people to be softened into silence. In a narrow service corridor, two junior aides spoke in hushed tones, their words clipped and cautious. "Have you heard anything?" one asked. "No," the other replied. "But files are moving." That alone was enough. Files did not move unless something had shifted at the top. Throughout the day, sealed envelopes changed hands. Requests were made without explanation. Interviews were scheduled under the guise of routine check-ins. Each action was small, procedural, deniable. Together, they formed an inquiry. And inquiries made people nervous. In a private study lined with books bound in dark leather, a long-serving advisor reread a memorandum he had signed years earlier. At the time, it had seemed inconsequential, an effort to de-escalate, to preserve calm. Now its language unsettled him. Words like miscommunication, perception, no further action required. He had believed those words served stability. Now he wondered what they had protected instead. By evening, the pattern could no longer be ignored. What had once appeared as isolated moments, each dismissed in the name of harmony, now aligned with unsettling clarity. The same names appeared repeatedly, the same responses, the same silence. This was not failure of rules. It was failure to apply them. William sat at his desk as reports began to arrive. Not conclusions, not accusations, but summaries of behavior that had never been permitted to accumulate before. He read without interruption. This was not about punishment. Not yet. It was about understanding how authority had been allowed to operate without boundary, shielded by rank and unchallenged by fear of disruption. The crown did not fear wrongdoing. It feared exposure. That fear had shaped every decision made in the margins. As night fell, the palace grew quiet once more. Lights dimmed in offices where staff lingered longer than usual, reluctant to leave while uncertainty remained unresolved. In one such office, the private secretary paused before sealing a folder. Inside lay a minor but undeniable breach of protocol. Small enough to have been ignored once, precise enough to be irrefutable now. It did not involve raised voices or public scenes. It involved an instruction given without authority, and obedience granted out of habit rather than obligation. That, more than anything, troubled William when he read it, because it revealed the true danger. Not misconduct, but compliance. He closed the folder and set aside. The rules that bound the crown were clear. They always had been. What had changed was not the law, but the willingness to enforce it without regard for convenience. William stood, the weight of the decision ahead settling fully now. This inquiry would not remain invisible, and the institution would not emerge unchanged. The palace did not divide loudly. It divided quietly, along lines that had always existed but had never been forced into the open. Loyalty against legality, stability against truth, tradition against the uncomfortable clarity of enforcement. By the third day, it was no longer possible to pretend that the inquiry was routine. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped when certain figures entered a room. Familiar courtesies tightened into formality. The palace was still orderly, but the ease had vanished, replaced by something brittle. William felt it immediately, not resistance in words, but in atmosphere. In a private conference room overlooking the east courtyard, senior household officials gathered at a long table. No press, no minutes taken aloud, only sealed notebooks and restrained expressions. The kind of meeting that existed precisely, so nothing could ever be quoted. William entered last. The room rose instinctively, then sat again at his gesture. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "What you are feeling," he said calmly, "is not disruption. It is accountability." No one responded. They were listening, but some were also bracing. The head of ceremonial operations cleared his throat. "With respect, sir, there's concern that this inquiry risks destabilizing internal balance. These matters have traditionally been handled discreetly." William nodded once. "Yes," he said, "that is precisely the issue." A murmur moved through the room, small, controlled, quickly suppressed. Another voice followed, measured and practiced. "The Crown survives on continuity. Public fracture, even internal, creates vulnerability." William leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "The Crown survives on legitimacy," he replied. "Continuity without boundaries is not strength. It is avoidance." Silence followed, not agreement, not defiance. Calculation. This was the moment where authority met its oldest challenger, tradition framed as protection. Later that afternoon, in a narrower corridor far from formal chambers, two senior aides spoke in lowered voices. "He's pushing too hard," one said. "He's pushing it all," the other replied. "That's the difference." The inquiry had begun to surface testimonies, not dramatic, not explosive, but cumulative. Staff reassigned without explanation. Instructions overridden quietly. Objections discouraged through tone rather than threat. None of it illegal, all of it improper. The danger lay not in any single act, but in the permission structure that formed around them. In a private study, William reviewed a newly submitted statement from a former aide, now long removed from daily palace life. The language was careful, restrained, almost apologetic. "I did not feel able to challenge the instruction at the time," the statement read. It was not presented as optional. William closed the folder slowly. This was the pattern. Authority had not been asserted loudly. It had been assumed and accepted, because challenging it felt more disruptive than compliance. By evening, resistance took clearer shape. A senior advisor, respected, experienced, deeply embedded in palace culture, requested a private audience. He stood rigidly as William entered, his expression unreadable. "I believe this inquiry is moving beyond its intended scope," the advisor said once they were alone. William did not sit. "And what was his intended scope?" he asked. "To assess a specific incident." The advisor replied, "Not to reopen settled matters." William's gaze sharpened. "Settled," he repeated. "Yes," the advisor said. "Handled internally. Resolved." William walked slowly toward the window, the gardens below glowing faintly under the evening lights. "Resolved for whom?" he asked. The advisor hesitated, just long enough. "For the institution," he said finally. William turned. "The institution is not protected by silence," he said. "It is compromised by it." The advisor's tone tightened. "There are limits to what can be challenged without consequence." William nodded. "I am aware," he said. "That is why I am proceeding anyway." The room fell quiet. This was no longer about documents. It was about lines of allegiance. That night, another report arrived, this one different. It did not describe behavior. It described obstruction. Meetings delayed. Requests redirected. Files returned incomplete. Not openly defiant, but unmistakably resistant. William read it once. Then again. Authority was no longer merely being examined. It was being tested. He summoned his legal advisor and head of security together, an alignment rarely used unless escalation was inevitable. "I want clarity," William said. "Where does protocol stand when tradition conflicts with enforcement?" The advisor answered carefully. "Protocol supports enforcement. Tradition resists timing." William nodded. "And security?" "Security follows lawful authority," the head replied, without interpretation. That settled it. By morning, the atmosphere shifted again. An internal directive circulated, concise, unambiguous. Cooperation with the inquiry was no longer optional. Delays would be noted, interference documented. The response was immediate. Some complied fully, Others complied visibly. A few complied reluctantly. And a handful did not comply at all. Those were the most revealing. In a small office tucked behind ceremonial halls, a long-serving official stared at the directive for several minutes before folding it carefully and placing it in a drawer. He had served 3 monarchs. He believed deeply in preservation, in shielding the crown from internal fracture. But preservation had become defiance. By midday, William received confirmation of noncompliance. He did not react outwardly. He reached instead for a draft document resting unfinished on his desk, an order that had been written, but not yet issued. It outlined authority clearly. It bypassed customary intermediaries. It named responsibility rather than implying it. Once delivered, there would be no ambiguity left. William stood, holding the document but not signing it yet. He understood the weight of this moment. To proceed meant forcing a choice, not just on others, but on the institution itself. To step back would preserve calm, but confirm that pressure still dictated boundaries. The palace had reached a threshold. Outside, the courtyard remained peaceful. Guards stood at attention. The crown appeared unshaken. Inside, lines were being drawn. William returned to his desk and set the unsigned order down carefully. Not yet, but soon, because authority unchallenged becomes habit, and habit, left unchecked, becomes abuse. The room was quiet as he stood alone with the decision ahead, aware that once this order left his hands, the household would never return to what had been before. The palace grew quieter as the inquiry deepened. Not the ordinary quiet of late evenings and extinguished lamps, but heavier stillness, weighted with awareness. Conversations shortened. Footsteps softened. Doors closed with deliberate care, as though sound itself might carry consequence. This was the cost of silence finally being counted. William felt it most at night, alone in his private study. He sat beneath a single lamp, its warm glow failing to soften the documents spread before him. Statements, memoranda, sealed testimonies written in careful language, each word chosen to protect both truth and survival. None of them accused loudly. They did not need to. What emerged instead was a pattern of omission, moments when intervention would have been uncomfortable, when correction would have disrupted harmony, when silence felt safer than confrontation. The crown had not been betrayed by malice. It had been eroded by restraint. In one testimony, a former aide described learning to recognize certain tones of instruction, tones that did not permit refusal, even when authority was unclear. Another recalled being reassigned without explanation after raising a concern that never made it into formal record. A third spoke of an understanding passed quietly from one staff member to another. This is not worth challenging. William closed the folder slowly. These were not failures of courage. They were failures of structure, systems that rewarded compliance and penalized disruption. Down the corridor, in a smaller, windowless office, the head of household operations sat alone, hands clasped tightly on the desk before him. He had served the palace faithfully for decades. He had memorized protocol, enforced decorum, protected continuity with unwavering discipline. Now, he waited to be summoned. He had already read the findings. He recognized his own handwriting in several margins. Notes made years ago. Decisions justified at the time as pragmatic. He had believed he was preserving order. He had not considered what that preservation required others to endure. When the summons finally came, he rose without hesitation. William stood when he entered. "Sit," William said gently. The word alone signaled that this was not an interrogation. "I need you to speak freely," William continued, not defensively. The man nodded once. "We normalize behavior we should have questioned," he said quietly without prompting, because it was easier than confronting rank. William listened without interruption. "We convince ourselves that silence was neutrality," the man went on. "That inaction was professionalism." William inhaled slowly. "And now," he asked. "Now," the man replied, "we see the damage." That damage was not measured in scandal or headlines. It was measured in trust quietly withdrawn, in boundaries blurred until no one remembered where they belonged. In another wing of the palace, a senior advisor, reviewed sealed correspondence late into the night. He had always considered himself a guardian of the institution, one who absorbed discomfort so the crown would not have to. Now, he understood the flaw in that thinking. Guardians who never challenge power eventually serve it. He set the letters aside, his hands trembling slightly. This was not a reckoning he had expected to face at this stage of his service. As dawn approached, William stood once more at the window of his study, watching the first light settle over the palace grounds. The architecture remained unchanged. Stone did not register regret, but people did. The inquiry had reached its conclusion, not because all questions were answered, but because the truth had become unmistakable. Silence had allowed conduct to persist. Protocol had been bent to avoid discomfort. Authority had gone unchecked because too many believed that stability required it. William returned to his desk. The unsigned order lay where he had left it. He picked it up. This document did not accuse. It did not explain. It enforced. It outlined corrective action, formal boundaries, removal of access, reassignment of authority. Every clause precise, every word deliberate. This was not punishment. This was separation. By mid-morning, key figures were notified. No announcement was made. No explanation offered beyond necessity. Those who needed to know were informed quietly, face to face. Some received the news with relief, some with resignation, a few with visible discomfort. One long-serving aide lowered her gaze and said nothing. Her silence now carried regret rather than compliance. In a corridor near the private chambers, two staff members stood aside as William passed. They did not speak, but one offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not allegiance. It was gratitude. The palace adjusted as it always had, efficiently, discreetly, without spectacle. Access routes were revised, schedules altered, roles clarified. The machine corrected itself. But beneath the efficiency lay something new. Acknowledgement. William returned to his study one final time before nightfall. The order had been executed. The decision was no longer theoretical. He sat down slowly, the weight of what had been done settling fully now. This was the cost of silence, realized not in chaos, but in clarity, in the understanding that restraint, when misapplied, becomes complicity. He had chosen disruption over comfort, legitimacy over quiet. The crown would endure, but would remember this moment not as scandal, not as rebellion, but as the instant when silence finally lost its authority. The palace did not announce a change. It never did. There were no raised voices echoing through corridors, no hurried footsteps betraying urgency, no visible signs of rupture. The crown did not move dramatically. It moved precisely, with the cold efficiency of an institution correcting its own alignment. By mid-morning, the order was already in motion. Two senior household officers walked side by side through a private corridor rarely used except for matters requiring discretion. Their pace was unhurried, their expressions neutral. They carried no papers in hand. Everything had already been documented, sealed, and authorized. This was not improvisation. This was execution. Outside the private apartments, guards stood at measured distance, not as a show of force, but as confirmation of boundary. Their presence was formal, restrained, and unmistakable. Access had been redefined. What had once been assumed was now controlled. Inside, personal staff worked quietly. Drawers were opened, wardrobes assessed, items cataloged with methodical care. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was damaged. Each movement followed protocol designed for moments when personal identity intersected with institutional separation. Belongings were not seized. They were concluded. An aide paused briefly over a framed photograph before placing it carefully into a padded container. Another checked a list twice before sealing a case. These were not expressions of sympathy or judgment, only professionalism under instruction. This was how the crown enforced decisions. Without spectacle, without emotion, without debate. Camilla stood near the window, her back to the room. She had not protested. Not now. The confrontation had passed. The arguments exhausted. What remained was reality, quiet, undeniable, procedural. Outside, the gardens looked unchanged. Sunlight filtered across trimmed hedges and stone pathways, indifferent of personal consequence. Behind her, the soft sound of zippers closing and clasps fastening marked the end of access more clearly than any decoration could have. For the first time, the weight of it settled fully. Not removal, finality. Elsewhere in the palace, William moved through his day without interruption. Briefings continued. Correspondence was reviewed. Schedules were honored. He did not retreat from visibility, nor did he seek attention. Leadership did not require performance. It required steadiness. When a senior aide approached him with confirmation, William listened without visible reaction. "It's being carried out," the aide said simply. William nodded once. No further instruction was necessary. In the legal office, documentation was finalized, language precise, unemotional, unassailable. This was not framed as conflict, but as correction. Authority realigned. Boundaries restored. Access formally curtailed. History would not record the hours of quiet labor that followed. It would not note the careful neutrality of those tasked with execution. It would remember only the outcome. By late afternoon, sealed cases were moved discreetly through secondary corridors, away from ceremonial spaces. No one paused to watch. No one whispered. The palace understood when not to look. This was dignity, not granted but enforced. In a private antechamber, a senior advisor paused alone for a moment longer than necessary. He had opposed inquiry in its early stages, not out of malice, but fear of destabilization. Now, watching the process unfold, he understood something he had resisted for years. Stability without ethics was illusion. He straightened his jacket and moved on. As evening approached, the palace returned to its practiced calm. Light softened. Staff rotated shifts. The machinery of monarchy continued uninterrupted. But something fundamental had changed. Authority was no longer assumed. It was defined. William stood once more at the window of his study, watching the final cases disappear down a long corridor below. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel relief. He felt responsibility, fully, unmistakably. This decision would follow him, not as controversy, but as precedent. He had chosen legacy over convenience, duty over familiarity, the future over the comfort of unchallenged tradition. The crown had been reminded of its center, and that center had held. The room behind him was quiet. No applause, no acknowledgement, just the stillness that follows irreversible action. The past had been packed carefully, respectfully, and without ceremony. It was no longer present. The palace returned to its familiar rhythm, not because nothing had happened, but because something had been resolved. Mornings resumed their measured pace. Guards stood where they always had. Corridors echoed with the same controlled footsteps that had defined royal life for centuries. To the untrained eye, the crown appeared unchanged, preserved in stone and ceremony. But institutions do not remember the way buildings do. They remember through precedent. What lingered after the final order was not disruption, but clarity. A recalibration of boundaries so subtle it would never be photographed, yet so precise it would quietly govern every interaction that followed. William understood this. He stood in the long gallery alone. Early in the morning, light filtering through tall windows and stretching across the polished floor. Portraits lined the walls. Monarchs capture a moment of confidence, resolve, restraint. None of them revealed the private decisions that had defined their reigns. History rarely does. It remembers outcomes, not hesitation. It remembers decisions, not debate. The crown had survived wars, abdications, public scandal, and private failure. It had endured because it learned when to adapt, and when to correct itself without spectacle. This moment would not enter textbooks. There would be no official statement marking the decision, no date circled in institutional memory. And yet, it would be remembered all the same, passed quietly through training, protocol, and the unspoken understanding of where authority truly resided. In private offices throughout the palace, adjustments were already taking hold. Language in briefings grew more precise. Boundaries were articulated rather than assumed. Silence, once mistaken for professionalism, was now recognized for what it could become: complicity. A junior aide paused during a routine instruction and asked for clarification. Politely, appropriately, without fear. The question was answered. The moment passed. But it mattered. That was how institutions change. Not through noise, but through permission. William returned to his study later that day and sat at his desk without urgency. The documents before him were ordinary now. Correspondence, schedules, reports unrelated to the inquiry that had consumed recent days. The crisis had not ended in triumph. It had ended in alignment. He reflected briefly, not on the confrontation, not on resistance, but on restraint, on the weight of authority exercised without anger, and the necessity of acting when silence had grown too heavy to justify. The crown did not require perfection. It required courage and stillness. As evening settled over the palace, lights glowed softly behind ancient windows. The structure remained as it always had, unchanged to the outside world, fortified by tradition and continuity. But within its walls, a lesson had been quietly absorbed. Power unchecked does not announce itself. It normalizes, and silence is how it survives. This time, silence had been interrupted, not with spectacle, not with outrage, but with decision. That was what the crown would remember. Not the tension of the moment, not the discomfort of correction, but the restraint that made accountability possible. And somewhere beyond these walls, beyond this story, another test would come, as it always does. Another rule would be stretched. Another silence would tempt preservation over principle. What mattered now was not whether the crown could avoid those moments, but whether it would recognize them when they arrived. Because history does not remember noise. It remembers the decisions made in stillness, when no one is watching, and the crown must choose what it stands for next.